Shoujo manga has a long and storied history, but one of the most important events in its history happened in the 1970s. That was when a group of young women combined elements from popular fiction, foreign media, and the shoujo manga of their childhood to create daring new works. They weren't the first women to make shoujo manga, but they did expand its style and scope in bold, even controversial ways. This is the story of the fabulous 49ers, the women that changed the course of shoujo manga forever. Today, I shall explain who they were and why they were so influential. As important as they are, there's still much about this group that's up for debate. The primary reason for this is that the Magnificent 49ers was never a formal group. This was not a designation that these women created for themselves, but instead one given to them after the fact by literary critics who wished to distinguish them from the more mainstream shoujo mangaka of the day. Not even the name for this group is set in stone, as it has evolved over the course of translation and time. Originally, they were called the Hana no Nijuyo Nengumi, literally the fabulous or flowery year 24 group. Later Japanese scholars would shorten this to just Nijuyo Nengumi, the year 24 group. This phrase would be translated as the Magnificent 49ers in the mid-1990s by translator Rachel Thorne, and it's this version that most English-speaking audiences will be familiar with, although more scholarly texts may also use the year 24 group interchangeably. So why do all of these names put so much emphasis on years and numbers? For reasons known only to the critics that coined the name, they decided to group these women around the idea that they were all born in the year 1949, or Showa year 24 on the Japanese regnal calendar. It's a strangely specific choice, as well as a largely incorrect one. Only a few of these women were born in that particular year. The rest were born between 1945 and 1950, making them part of Japan's own post-war baby boom. But there's so much more to them than just their birth year. They were part of a generation that benefited greatly from the rapid changes to the Japanese economy, politics, and women's rights that came with the end of the American occupation. They also benefited greatly from the changes going on in shoujo manga during that time. They were part of the first generation of Japanese girls to grow up reading shoujo manga. While shoujo manga did technically exist before the war, it flourished and evolved as never before during the 1950s and 60s, in no small part because many young women would begin to write shoujo manga themselves. Early shoujo mangaka, such as Hideko Mizuno and Masako Watanabe, were just as influential on these women as the likes of Osamu Tezuka and Shotaro Ishinomori, and they would set the stage for these young women. I should note that this is something I will be talking much more in depth about as part of my panel on Saturday. So who were the Magnificent 49ers? Believe it or not, scholars can't even necessarily agree upon who does or does not count. While most can agree on the most prominent members, the lack of formal definition leaves the rest up for debate. Can any notable shoujo mangaka of the early 70s be considered a 49er? What about the men who collaborated with them as editors? Do we include those who are not necessarily mangaka, but instead were influential friends or associates of the more prominent members? There's no single correct answer to any of these questions. So for the sake of this panel, I consulted as many sources as I could to create my own list. This is by no means a definitive list, but it's the closest I can get to what can reasonably be called a critical consensus. One of the most recognized 49ers in the English-speaking world would be Moto Hagio. She was a studious child and a talented artist from a young age, pursuing a career in manga in spite of her parents' disapproval. She would make her professional debut at age 20, and from that point onward, she made a name for herself with her many thoughtful, serious tales exploring the depths of psychology, spirituality, gender, and science. Close behind Hagio would be her former associate and roommate, Keiko Takamiya. Like Hagio, she would be inspired by the many early shonen and shoujo manga she read as a child. She would make her professional debut at age 18, pitching stories to just about every shoujo manga publisher possible while simultaneously working on a degree in education. Over time, Takamiya distinguished herself not just with her own brand of ethereal, dreamlike art, but also by her fondness for science fiction and high melodrama. Ryoko Ikeda has been making manga since her debut in 1967, but she was skyrocketed to international fame thanks to the runaway success of 1972's The Rose of Versailles. It's rather fitting that her best known manga is about history and political upheaval, considering that in her youth she had studied philosophy at college and dabbled with some of these student political groups of the late 1960s. These days, she tends to focus more on making manga about classical music, a reflection of her own study of opera. Yumiko Ueshima is perhaps not as well known outside of Japan as the last few women I've listed, but she is no less influential than any of them. Ever since her debut in 1968, she has created a bevy of short stories that combine delicate artwork and surreal imagery with an intense focus on the stories of young women suffering through the anxieties of adolescence and mental illness. Even her most light-hearted work, The Star of Cottonland, explores the very definition of what it means to be human through the eyes of a kitten who believes herself to be human. The same could be said for Ryoko Yamagishi. She was inspired in her youth by the illustrations of Aubrey Beardsley and other Art Nouveau era artists. From her debut in 1968 onward, she would use her live, elegant art to illustrate all sorts of stories, be they about tormented young schoolgirls in love, a fanciful psychic-themed take on the tale of the legendary Prince Shotoko, or the competitive and psychologically strenuous world of ballet. The latter would draw upon her memories of her childhood ballet lessons to expertly capture the dancer's elegant movements. Yasuko Aoki was not necessarily any older than her fellow 49ers, but she made her start as a mangaka far earlier, making her professional debut in 1963 at the tender age of 15. She grew up in a large working-class family, but found inspiration in the pages of shoujo manga and encouragement from her father, who dabbled in inkwash painting as a hobby. While her early work largely consisted of frothy, giddy romances, her later works would be defined by a unique combination of comedy, history, and action, along with a healthy dose of homoeroticism. Toshie Kihara would make her professional debut in 1969, at age 21. She would make her earliest manga in her spare time, while working at a day job at a bank. While she made many cute, fluffy romances during the 1970s, it was her historical dramas that would ultimately bring her critical acclaim, whether it was her adaptation of the French adventure novel series Angélique, or more original stories that drew upon relatively recent Japanese history. Minoru Kimura is probably one of the most obscure of the Magnificent 49ers. She was a contemporary of Yasuko Aoki, making her professional debut in 1964 at age 14. She would work on her manga during her vacations from high school and college. Kimura would make a name for herself with a vast array of sensitive slice-of-life stories, many of which starred young children. Of course, it's not just to go over a list of who the Magnificent 49ers are. What made them important were the works they created. So why are the Magnificent 49ers so important? There are many reasons, but we'll begin with the one that had the widest and longest-lasting impact: their role in the creation of the genre known as boys' love. The credit for this is usually given to Moto Hagio and Keiko Takamiya, but it also owes something to a screenwriter and mutual friend of theirs named Norie Masayama. She was a woman with highbrow taste in media from across the world, and she shared many of her favorites with her friends in the hopes of inspiring them to write great manga. It also just so happened that a lot of her favorites happened to revolve around gay men, be it the European films she loved so much, the avant-garde novels she liked to read, or the issues of the early gay men's magazine Barazoku that she would share with her friends, proving that even before the word fujoshi was ever coined, Fujos were gonna Fujo. Hagio and Takamiya took the inspiration that they received from Masayama and used it to start separately working on some new short stories. These works would not be about the usual starry eyed young girls, but instead beautiful young boys falling for one another against the backdrop of historic European boarding schools. Takamiya would be the first to publish hers in 1970 with a story called In the Sunroom. Hagia would follow up a year later with her own short story, The November Gymnasium. These works made an impression on their audiences, but they were merely warm-ups for the manga that were to come. In 1974, after years of hard work on the premise and a chance meeting with a receptive editor, Moto Hagio would publish what many consider to be the first boys' love manga series, The Heart of Thomas. Takamiya would release her own series, Kaze Toki no Uta, or The Song of Wind and Trees, 2 years afterwards. Takamiya spent many years on her concept, but she was determined that it was not going to be rejected. She refused to submit it to her editors until she had finally built up enough popularity that one of her manga would be ranked #1 in the magazine in which it was published. These two series are different in many interesting ways. The Heart of Thomas is a thoughtful and relatively chaste work set against the backdrop of early 20th century Germany. Hagio's focus is not so much on the romantic tension between her protagonists, Yuli and Eric, but instead on the journey of personal and spiritual growth that the two young men undergo. Together, they overcome their respective family traumas and cope with the fallout of a suicide of a dead classmate, along with the new boy who looks disturbingly like him. Meanwhile, The Song of Wind and Trees is more of a traditional tragic melodrama. It is set in a 19th century French boarding school, and it follows the story of the steadfast Serge as he falls for his troubled roommate Gilbert and strives to help him move past years of emotional and sexual abuse from his guardian. While The Song of Wind and Trees was not explicit with its content, Takamiya did make it clear that the boys in this story were definitely doing a lot more than just stealing kisses. Yet, for all their differences, they also had a lot of similarities. Both of them were very controversial in their time, not just for their open portrayal of homosexuality, but for the way they handled heavy subjects, such as suicide and sexual abuse. They also both struggled initially in their serializations, both performing poorly in their magazine popularity polls. Yet the both of them would be saved thanks to the combination of the passionate responses from their readers and strong book sales. Their eventual success would ensure that these two manga would become not just classics in their own right, but serve as the foundation for a new genre that other shoujo mangaka of the time would build upon in their own unique ways. For example, Toshihei Kihara would write her own version of a boy's love story in the late 1970s, with her best-known work, Mari and Shingo. She wouldn't stray too far from the type of drama that Hagio and Takamiya had pioneered with the genre. The biggest changes she made to the formula was to age her characters up slightly to young adulthood and to switch the setting away from continental boarding schools and more towards early Showa-era Japan. Meanwhile, other mangaka took these ideas and ran with them in completely different directions. For example, Yasuko Aoki chose to make her most popular and long-running manga, From Eroica with Love, not a tragic romance, but instead a zany adventure series full of action and espionage. A series where a world-famous gay art thief can chase after the masterpieces and the German NATO officer he loves, in a scenario that owes a lot more to Lupin III than it does to the Heart of Thomas. Of course, boys' love would continue to flourish for many decades afterwards, far beyond the point of the Magnificent 49ers. It would eventually grow to the point that there would be entire manga magazines dedicated to it. It would become an industry unto itself, spawning hundreds of fan works, anime, audio drama, merchandise, and more manga careers than you could possibly count. The world of manga would be a very different place if Hagio and Takamiya had stuck entirely to making stories about heterosexual romance. Those weren't the only sort of same sex stories that the Magnificent 49ers were telling at the time. They also helped to create Yuri manga. It turns out that both Boys Love and Yuri have roots that run deep into shoujo manga's earliest days. Serialized stories of tragic lesbian romances between schoolgirls had been all the rage in pre-war shoujo magazines. While these stories had fallen out of style by the time that the 49ers were born, many of them were still considered essential reading for young girls during their youth. Many of these stories would go on to inspire some of the earliest boys' love manga, so perhaps it was not that much of a surprise that someone would try to translate the same idea a little more directly to the world of shoujo manga. The first Yuri manga would make its debut in 1971. This would be Ryoko Yamagishi's Shiroi Heya wa Futari, or Our White Room. It was a tale of two young Catholic schoolgirls, one being a fair-haired, sheltered orphan, and the other being a dark-haired rebel with a troubled relationship to her mother. The two of them swiftly fall for one another after being assigned as roommates, but their romance is a troubled one from the start, and it eventually ends in tragedy. This manga would prove to be a hit, and thus many of the 49ers would dabble in Yuri manga over the course of the next decade. While the details of the stories would obviously change, many of the Yuri manga that they were writing during this time followed a very similar sort of plot trajectory. Like the boys' love stories they were creating at the same time, these manga would explore the emotional depths of these characters as they wrangled not only with their feelings for one another, but also the forces of societal oppression, social class, familial abuse, mental illness, bullying, and the disturbingly frequent reveal of accidental incest that all too often drove them apart. Even when they were working in established genres, the Magnificent 49ers used their manga to explore many complex subjects from a decidedly feminist perspective. One that has generated a lot of discussion and research over the years is how they handled the subject of gender. They did break some ground by featuring characters who were explicitly transsexual, a rarity in Japanese media of the time. Sometimes they were the star of the show, such as in Ryoko Ikeda's Claudine, while in others they were merely supporting players, like in Mota Hagio's sci-fi classic They Were 11. What made these characters revolutionary was that they were not merely there to supply cheap jokes about cross-dressing or gay panic. Instead, they were well-rounded characters in their own right. They were people who were just striving to find a place in the world, or in outer space in the case of They Were 11, where they could live and love as their true selves. Sometimes they were successful, and sometimes they were not. But they were always handled with some degree of sympathy and sensitivity by their creators. Other works would draw upon manga from the past and other Japanese cultural landmarks, such as the Takarazuka acting troupe, to explore the notion of gender through non-conforming heroines. The most obvious example of this is Oscar de Jargeret, the heroine of Ryoko Ikeda's The Rose of Versailles. Oscar is biologically female, but is raised as a boy from her birth, an arrangement that seemingly everyone else around her is aware of and most do not question. But as the series goes on, Oscar's story becomes just as much about her struggle with the demands that others place upon her because of her gender and her role as a military leader, as much as it does with the turmoil of Marie Antoinette's court and the build-up to the French Revolution. This was a struggle that clearly resonated with a lot of young women at the time, and because of this, it would help the series to become a veritable multimedia franchise in its own right over the next few decades. The 49ers would also play a major role in bringing science fiction to the world of shoujo manga. These women all grew up in the glory days of science fiction, and many of them would cite authors such as Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and Ray Bradbury as both influences and personal favorites of theirs. Naturally, it would make sense that they would try to marry the fantastical stories that they loved as children with the emotion and psychological depth that they were already bringing to their shoujo manga. Moto Hagio would write many short sci-fi stories over the course of her career that dealt with science fiction concepts like genetics, cloning, and the depths of psychology, such as those collected in the A Prime collection. Even the previously mentioned They Were 11 is a good representative of her particular brand of shoujo sci-fi fusion. This story is ostensibly a mystery, as a group of young adults from across the galaxy are put upon a spaceship as part of a test where they must survive to pass. Early on, they discover that there's seemingly one too many of them, and they find themselves investigating not just who this interloper may be, but the mystery behind the ship itself. Another prominent example would be Keiko Takemiya's To Terra. While this strictly isn't shoujo manga, this work would become one of her most famous and frequently adapted titles. And part of what made it so popular is that she brought her own fusion of shoujo emotion and sci-fi action to it. This series centers on two young men. The first is Jomi, who is cast out from his idyllic society when they discover he has psychic powers. Soon he discovers that there is an entire community of cast-out psychics just like him, and eventually becomes their leader. The second young man is Keith, who is cold and robotic, but becomes suspicious of the supercomputer that has served as his mother for all of his life. The same supercomputer that controls the inhabitants on the space colony where he lives. While these two young men face very different challenges, they are unwittingly united under one goal: to push back against the societies that hold them back and return humanity to the planet Earth. This would be far from the last time that Keiko Takemiya would work on a sci-fi manga. She would eventually work with noted Japanese sci-fi author Ryo Mitsuse to adapt his Andromeda Stories novels into a manga. This story is more of a conventional science fiction fantasy, one where an exiled prince fights back against the mechanical forces that took over his planet, in fulfillance of a prophecy that was made when he was born. Of course, not all the changes that the Magnificent 49ers made to shoujo manga involved genre or themes. They also revolutionized the way shoujo manga looked. They utilized a lot more multi-layer free-form panels and page layouts than the shoujo mangaka that came before them, breaking down the literal boundaries of the page. They would let the inner monologues from their characters drift across the page like petals. Their panels were often full of flowers that were not just decorative in purpose, but also served as visual metaphors for the emotions that the characters felt in the moment. The imagery itself became surreal and dreamlike, drawing as much from modern art as it did from shoujo manga conventions. It should be noted that not all of these techniques were brand new. A lot of the visual language and structures they used were pioneered by those who had created the shoujo and shonen manga they grew up reading. Yet each of the Magnificent 49ers brought with them not just their own personal art styles, but a level of artistic maturity beyond their age that allowed them to enhance the themes and emotional arcs through their art. Together, they would create montages of stunning, heartbreaking beauty, where panels flowed from one another as freely as water. Their characters would drift and swirl through dreamscapes of feelings and flowers, or descend into dark, swirling voids of despair. Their visual style would become one of the most iconic elements of their manga, and it would influence many shoujo mangaka to come. Their legacy would change not just the face of shoujo manga, but the face of its fandom as well. While they had plenty of teenage girl fans, their works also attracted a lot of older, less conventional fans, as well as a number of male ones. Some of them would even put together fan clubs, where they would discuss the works of the Magnificent 49ers. Some of them even put together fanzines to show off their fan art and writing, such as these seen here. Sadly, these groups were often ostracized by the existing sci-fi and fantasy fans of the time, who were far more focused on professional literary works instead of making tributes to manga made for girls. It would be up to one group, a Moto Hagio fan club called Meikyu, to put together an event that they called a manga fanzine fair in the winter of 1975 at a humble public hall in Tokyo. The turnout for this event was far greater than they ever could have imagined. They brought in over 700 attendees that day, 90% of which were women. All of them were sharing fanzines, fan art, and other creative works that were not just about the manga of the Magnificent 49ers, but about other shoujo series as well. And some of them were even about popular actors or rock bands of the day. This humble get-together would become the foundation of a regular fan event that would continue to decades to come. It would eventually become known as Comic Market. Most of you probably know it better by its abbreviation, Comiket. Sadly, not all of the fandom around the Magnificent 49ers was so positive or constructive. In a how-to column written by Moto Hagio in the mid-1970s, she would sometimes talk about fans that she dubbed maniacs, and that modern readers might call hipsters or stans. These were no mere ordinary shoujo manga fans. They were obsessed with the work of the 49ers. They would arrange letter-writing campaigns to support their favorites, which the editors jokingly called love letters. They also actively and vocally scorned other popular manga of the time, shoujo or otherwise. They would send harassing letters to more popular shoujo mangaka, criticizing them for supposedly ripping off their favorites and urging them to quit making manga entirely. Not even their beloved 49ers were exempt from some of this more negative behavior. If any of these women tried to change their style up a little or try writing something that was maybe a little more lighthearted, these fans would send them hate mail. Some of them even went so far to call them at their personal phone numbers or show up at their homes to argue with them about how their manga was art and that real shoujo manga didn't need things like comedy, and how dare they ruin their perfect, beautiful manga with such basic pandering. Everyone should be thankful that things like the internet or social media weren't around when such fans were active. This would not be the only criticism levied at the Magnificent 49ers over the years. Japanese literary critics in the 1970s were enchanted with their works, but in their efforts to heap praise upon them, they all too often ended up delivering backhanded compliments, which just exposed their scorn for more traditionally feminine media like shoujo manga. They would describe the works of the 49ers as something separate from shoujo manga, almost too good for such a base demographic. And they scorned the shoujo manga that came before them, and other more mainstream shoujo manga, as too frivolous and shallow to be worthy of their attention. Other critics went in a completely different direction, accusing them of being too highbrow, too far removed from the rest of their peers to ever be really influential. Some of these critics would even try to go so far as to divide up the shoujo mangaka of the day into 3 neat and tidy categories. The first of these categories centered on historical dramas, coming-of-age stories, sports stories, anything that allowed their readers to experience them by proxy through the heroine. The second were focused on more realistic, down-to-earth, and introspective stories that focused on the heroine's emotional growth. The last of these domains was the one dedicated to the 49ers, which they described as being ambitious and like art house films that appealed to those that found the other categories too childish. For all the formality of this method, it still has many of the same problems as the other critiques I've just mentioned. It doesn't account for the ability for any of these shoujo mangaka, 49 or otherwise, to change style or genre as they saw fit, or that such trends might change over the long term. It also presumes that it can divide the audience for shoujo manga into the same neat and tidy categories, as if manga readers didn't and couldn't just pick and choose whatever series they preferred to read at any given time. In the 1990s, some Japanese feminist scholars argued that the 49ers' early boys' love titles did more harm than good when it came to gay people. These women criticized these works for not being representative of the perspectives and struggles of actual queer young men at that time. Furthermore, they saw these works as exploitative, as they codified some of the harmful stereotypes and ideas that they got from their Western influences, and that they turned these relationships into a spectacle for heterosexual girls and women. In fairness, many of the 49ers, then and now, were honest about the fact that they never intended these characters to be realistic portrayals of young gay men. Instead, they viewed them more like vessels through which they could explore more complex or abstract ideas, and that their focus on homosexual relationships allowed them to explore the notion of love on a more philosophical level, without necessarily being beholden to any expectations of marriage or family or gender roles that tended to come with more heterosexual relationships. Criticisms like these remain fairly rare, though, as most scholars agree that the positive impact of the works of the 49ers far outweigh any limitations that might have come about due to their age. The Magnificent 49ers have left an incredible and far-reaching impact upon the world of manga. Their works broadened shoujo manga's horizons in remarkable new ways, both visually and narratively. Their complex themes and stunning visuals would not only inspire thousands of artists and fans, but bring in an older, less conventional audience who might not have touched shoujo manga otherwise. Their focus on female perspectives and feminist themes would help lay the groundwork for the creation of josei manga just a decade later. Through the creation of Boys Love and Yuri manga, they helped create a space where LGBTQ stories and themes were not just normalized, but humanized, an important first step at a time when such topics were still quite taboo in Japanese media. These manga might not have always been perfect representation, but they would help pave the way for later, more openly queer mangaka to create stories of their own that better reflected their own experiences. Finally, it should be noted that their legacy didn't end when the 1970s did. Their impact can be felt throughout the decades. You can find it in Maya Mineo's work on the shoujo parody series Patario. You can see it in big shoujo hits from the 1980s, ranging from Koi Ikeno's fluffy horror romance Tokimeki Tonight to the hard-boiled shoujo drama of Akemi Yoshida's Banana Fish. It even extends into the 1990s, with people like Chiho Saito, one of the creators of Revolutionary Girl Utena, citing them as an influence. Their reach would end up extending to some unexpected places, in manga series seemingly far removed from the world of shoujo manga. The late Kentaro Miura was always upfront about the fact that he was a fan of works like The Song of Wind and Trees and The Rose of Versailles, and that both of these works were a major influence on Berserk. Haruko Kumota, the creator of Showa Genroku Rakugo Shinju, and Yuki Kamitani, the creator of Our Dream at Dusk, both cite Moto Hagio as a major influence on their work. Even something as dopey as Hyperdolls, a mostly forgotten Dirty Pair knockoff, took inspiration, in part, from Moto Hagio's vampire series The Poe Clan, alongside things like Ultraman and kaiju films. The Magnificent 49ers are still alive and well to this day, continuing to grow as people and as artists over the decades as they pursue their passions. Some of them even went into education, doing their part to directly train new generations of mangaka. Most importantly, all of them continue to make manga to this day. Most of them are not as prolific as they once were, but they continue to craft new stories, win more awards, and explore new genres. The concept of the Magnificent 49ers is not one that is set in stone, a short-lived phenomenon that merely came and went decades ago. Theirs is a story that is still being written to this day, and one that will hopefully continue for many years to come. I do have a few final notes to review before I wrap things up. I have 2 more panels coming up this weekend. On Saturday afternoon, I'll be presenting Shoujo Manga's Lost Generation, where you can learn more about the early history of shoujo manga. On Sunday night, I'll be wrapping up the convention with the story of Anime Rama. If you want to read more of my thoughts on manga, shoujo or otherwise, you can go to my blog, The Manga Test Drive, which is at mangatestdrive.blogspot.com, where you can read over 9 years worth of manga reviews. I also have a side blog, Renaissance Josei, which is at renaissancejosei.blogspot.com, where I post longer reviews and essays about anime and manga. I am an occasional contributor to Anime Feminist, and you can read the many essays and podcast appearances I've done there. If you enjoy what I do here or elsewhere online, to the point that you would like to give me money for it on the regular, you can do so at Patreon at Megan D. Otherwise, you can follow me on Twitter at Brainchild129. Finally, I do want to urge you all that whenever possible, please support the official releases of these women's work. Seven Seas is currently publishing Ryoko Ikeda's Claudine. Udon Entertainment recently wrapped up their lavish release of The Rose of Versailles, one that was literally years in the making. Keiko Takamiya's To Terra is available digitally through Manga Planet. Fantagraphics is currently publishing Motahagio's The Poe Clan, and recently announced that they will be republishing her short story collection A Drunken Dream sometime later this year. Denpa Books recently announced that they will be publishing Motahagio's They Were 11 in 2022, and that's not even getting into the other classic works by these women that were published in the past in English but have since fallen out of print. They are all great manga that deserve to be on your shelves, and the more that English language audiences support them, the more likely we are to get more. So with all of that out of the way, thank you all for watching, and enjoy the rest of the convention.